Welcome. I'm Tom Croxton from the Division of Lung Diseases of National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. I will be moderating this second session of the webinar and welcome everyone who is joining us. The previous session dealt with the issue of occupational COPD somewhat from the perspective of the workplace. This second session is going to deal with a lot of the same issues, but I see it as approaching this topic in the context of the broader definition of COPD and specifically smoking-related COPD. So I think these speakers are going to be sharing information about how occupational COPD may or may not differ from smoking-related COPD in terms of its presentation, in terms of its treatment, in terms of the research necessary to study it. Let's move straight on into Dr. Menino, who's going to be looking a little more from a therapeutic perspective. David?
Okay, thank you. So this is going to be something completely different. This is looking at clinical trials, and when I was tasked with this, I was thinking, boy, I don't think there are a whole lot of clinical trials out there, and actually that was correct. Although in looking at this, and we were pretty much, and I actually sort of asked around some of my colleagues at the COPD Foundation who have spent a lot of time involved with clinical trials and didn't come up with a whole lot. Although I did not look at, for example, alpha-1 replacement therapy, which has non-smokers in that, nor did I look at devices such as valves and the like. So these are my conflict of interest statements. I did have some employment at GSK and serve as a consultant to some drug companies, and perhaps most closely related to this, I work as an expert witness for individuals that are suing the tobacco industry, and including one case that actually involves a flight attendant with secondhand smoke exposure. So, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, going through how COPD has been defined in the context of clinical trials, and I can close this here. Okay. Oops. There we go. As you can see, and this is sort of a different version of what Graham just showed you, but we in pulmonary love our overlapping circles and the squares, and this is actually the and the ATS 95 definition of what comprised COPD. With the overlap of chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma, then with this sort of square of obstructive airflow limitation. And the 95 ATS definition, COPD was actually sort of like that intersection of chronic bronchitis or emphysema, with the presence of obstructive airflow limitation, and this was less well defined. I think they used a FEV1 FVC cutoff of 0.75 in this original, but this sort of goes way back to to Charlie Fletcher's SIBA symposium back in the late 50s, that sort of was trying to sort of lay the groundwork for what comprised chronic lower respiratory diseases, and so this sort of hails back to that. And when the initial global initiative on chronic obstructive lung disease came along in 2001, they sort of tweaked this a bit. So we still have the three overlapping circles, but now COPD was sort of defined as this post-bronchodilator obstructive airflow limitation. So now everybody that's sort of in that rectangle would be defined as having evidence of obstruction or COPD. So actually, it sort of made it because I was at CDC at the time, and this sort of made the epidemiologic sort of look at COPD a little different, because then we could, look, for example, at some national data from NHANES to get a different estimate of both this presence of obstruction and see how it related to both diagnosed COPD or chronic bronchitis, asthma, or emphysema. So it gave us a different perspective. And I also want to talk a little bit about COPD gene 2019 that is looking, and I think in an interesting way, to expand how we think about COPD. And this is what they call the COPD diamond. And in a nutshell here, they look at these 4 different components: exposure. And everybody in COPD gene was a smoker, although he sort of read between the lines here, that exposure could also be exposure within the context of an occupational setting or environmental exposures, but then also including the component of imaging that you just heard Graham talk a great deal about. Symptomatology, which was mostly defined by a dyspnea score of 2 or more, or chronic bronchitis. So you could also use a CAT score, or I guess an SGRQ to get that. And then spirometry, using that FEV1 FVC ratio of less than 0.7, although they also then sort of had this additional spirometric possibility of an FEV1 less than 80% predicted. That then sort of brings in sort of like the world of people either with restrictive spirometry, they call it PRISM, in COPD gene, but sort of is expanding, the spirometric definition for potential COPD, and then sort of goes through this classification scheme where you start with, with you only have one facet of the diamond that's no COPD. If you have 2, that's possible. 3 would be probable, 4 would be definite. And although it isn't mentioned here, I guess there is also that potential that in the absence of an identifiable exposure, if you have a couple of these other components, that might also be a way to get to possible or probable COPD. So now this is my interpretation of how COPD gene looked at these diamonds, or the overlapping circles, and what is different here now is you sort of I've put that sort of restrictive airflow limitation on top of the obstruction, and now we have possible, probable, and definite COPD based on the degree of overlapping of these circles. And Paul and I were talking a little bit earlier about Lancet Commission on COPD just published within the past week an exhaustive view, and this was headed by Diana Stoltz from Switzerland and Mark Dransfield from UAB, along with a sort of a collection of all-stars in the COPD world that looked at how to basically move the needle on COPD, because the problem is that we're finding disease way too late in its pathologic progression, and that if we really want to make a difference both in diagnosis, therapeutics, and disease modification, we need to sort of rethink COPD, including, I think, some of the concepts that were pushed forward in the COPD gene, and whether you call it pre-COPD or early COPD. I think these are things that we need to sort of explore. Now, if we move on to how COPD is defined within the context of clinical trials, and now we sort of go back to this is basically the gold document that pretty much every clinical trial out there, at least looking at drug therapeutics, has a 10-pack year floor of cigarette smoking. So people have to have at least 10 pack years in there. So that sort of eliminates anybody with non-smoking COPD, be it from from alpha-1. Actually, alpha-1 is almost always excluded from COPD clinical trials. But certainly people with occupational related COPD have been excluded. In addition, every COPD clinical trial excludes current asthma. There are a couple in more recent years that have not made that exclusion, but for the most part, anybody with a history of asthma, and actually some of the more restrictive ones, have excluded people with any lung disease prior to the age of 40. So that's then sort of wipes out that part of the circle. In addition, most trials require the presence of symptoms, typically dyspnea, occasionally bronchitis. So then we're sort of left with an even sort of smaller part of this, and then most require post-bronchodilator obstruction. So what we started out with compared to what we actually end up getting when we're looking at COPD clinical trials is a small piece of the overall pie. And how does this work when people have actually looked at this? And this is a study that David Halpin did in 2016 that basically looked at the proportion of people that were in their clinic who had COPD, who meet study criteria for a number of clinical trials. And these are looking at various therapies. These are all bronchodilator therapies, but you can see that it ranges for some of these dual bronchodilators from a low of like 5 or 6% to and some studies might be as high as 60%, but for the most part, and it was most sort of sat in that maybe 15, 20 to 20% range. And the challenge here is that you're then trying to then utilize these therapies in all of these patients, even though they were developed and tested and approved basically on a small subset of these populations. And this now looks at more current data. This is from 2020. Actually various names. These trials. So IMPACT was, for example, the GSK study of a triple therapy, and if you apply both the inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's about 15% of people sort of coming through the door. And you can sort of look up and down the list. The Summit, which was targeting people with risk factors for cardiovascular disease, also had COPD as a low of 3%, and in a dual bronchodilator, we got as high as 40%. But most of them are sort of in that 10-15% range. So. Moving along in clinical trials, how do we define endpoints in these COPD clinical trials? And this is sort of another issue. And in this Lancet Commission report, this is something else that has sort of been is a problem. And this is the frustration. This is something that we at the COPD Foundation talk about a great deal, because in essence, COPD is defined by having obstructive spirometry does not respond to therapy. And then pretty much every therapy that has been approved for COPD has been based on a response to therapy. So in essence, we sort of define a disease one way, and then we approve therapies based on something that really shouldn't happen. But most therapies that have been approved in COPD have been bronchodilators, and this is looks at an improvement in FEV1. That is, basically, looking at either trough FEV1 or a curve over a period of time. Therapies have also been approved based in reduction in exacerbations. And the first trials, and these can be relatively short, which in the COPD world would be 3 months, but they're typically 6 months or 12 months. Exacerbation studies are almost always 12-month studies, and typically have to be enriched with patients who have a history of exacerbations. So again, that sort of is again one of the other reasons we saw limitations previously. Improvement in quality of life measures, St. George Respiratory Questionnaire, COPD assessment tests are the ones most frequently used, although and these are almost always done in conjunction with one of the changes above. Occasionally, you might see sort of an SGRQ make it onto a label, but I'm not aware of any COPD therapy that has been approved based on improvement in quality of life measure. And then, sort of like the ultimate improvement would be a decrease in mortality, or no therapy in the COPD space has ever been approved that I'm aware of to date based on a decrease in mortality. And these are tough. You can only die once, so you need big numbers, and people studied over multiple years to reach this threshold. And the study that came closest to it was TORCH, and that had the infamous p-value of 0.052, so it didn't reach statistical significance. Even for various reasons for that. And this, in fact, looks at data. This is from Impact Study. So this is a study of nearly 10,000 people, and with 3 arms. So there's no placebo here. So you're comparing 3 active therapies: triple therapy, an ICS LABA, and a LAMA-LABA of umeclidinium, vilanterol. And as you can see, trough FEV1 was the main therapy, and if you look at mean change from baseline at 1 year, and it was improved relative to comparator arms. They also looked at SGRQ, quality of life measure, and although the mean change showed some difference, this did not quite meet the statistical significance, although another way of looking at SGRQ is looking at people that sort of meet that 4-point threshold. So this is called a responder analysis, and there you got an odds ratio in the triple therapy compared to the dual bronchodilator that did meet that threshold. Another endpoint in this study looked at exacerbations. So again, this looks at exacerbation rates, with the lowest rate being in triple therapy relative to the 2 other therapies. And then you can see the time to the first event analysis showing that the triple therapy group was below the other 2. So again, that's sort of how therapies are approved in the context of clinical trials in COPD. So what's COPD trials out there that have included never smokers? And again, the list is few. In our sort of review, we found really a total of 2. This was a Boehringer Ingelheim sponsored study in China that was looking at patients with mild to moderate COPD, and they basically compared tiotropium versus placebo. So a placebo-controlled trial. 21% of participants were never smokers, and this was basically a negative trial because they were looking at FEV1 decline over a period of time, and it failed to reach statistical significance and did not show results separately for the never smokers that were included in this trial. And then another trial, this was done by Christine Jenkins and others. And this was basically sort of looking at treatment of COPD using low dose theophylline versus theophylline plus prednisone versus placebo. Again, trying to look at because one of the challenges, particularly in low and middle income countries, is access to bronchodilators is not as widespread as one might hope. So, so this was looking at sort of an alternative, lower cost, therapy. In this trial, and this was, looking at exacerbations. So about a quarter of participants in this one were never smokers, and notably in this study, which was published last year, and there was not a reduction in exacerbations between the arms when compared to placebo. So, and finally, what COPD trials out there have been limited to never smokers, and in all of the literature, I found a total of one in this, and this was a randomized controlled trial of a crossover coming from Mexico that looked at never smoking women with biomass smoke exposure and moderate to severe COPD. That was essentially looking at to see whether they responded differently to indacaterol, which is a long-acting beta agonist, compared to tiotropium, which is a muscarinic antagonist. And basically participants received one dose of medication in the study and then looked at response at 24 hours later. So in this graphic, the red doses are are indacaterol pre and post. So like pink is pre and post, whereas the blue is tiotropium. And as you can see, so this is trough spirometry, and you measured it at 23.5 hours after the dose, and there was an improvement in both FEV1 and FVC in both of these groups and inspiratory capacity, with no real difference between the groups. And I think that it's, the bottom line here is that, at least in this group of patients with biomass smoke-related COPD, the responses seen were similar to one would expect to see in COPD related to smokers, because these results were rather similar to that. And they also looked at the proportion of subjects achieving minimally clinically important differences, MCIDs, looking at metrics of 6-minute walk. So this was 35-meter improvement, dyspnea, which is a 2-point on the Borg scale, inspiratory capacity, which was 10% difference in FEV1, 100 milliliter difference, and there was really no significant difference between the two therapies. So these were their conclusions, and importantly, and they just looked at a single dose of medication. There may be some advantage to using therapy over a longer period of time, and there's and this was a study that's currently in progress in Uganda, and this is that Trishul Siddharthan out of University of Miami, formerly out of Hopkins, and this is sort of a follow-up study to the GECKO study that was being done by Will Checkley and John Hurst. That was looking at people from in 4 countries around the world, with a focus on COPD in their communities of these countries, but also focusing on never smokers in there. So, so these are basically patients with obstruction on spirometry, and this will be looking at low-dose theophylline to see if there's an improvement in these outcomes in a 12-month study. So they're looking at the usual 2 quality of life measures, and spirometry, and also looking at some serum markers of inflammation. So this is what the study protocol looks like. And it's in progress, and we're hoping to see data from that in the very near future. So, unfortunately, virtually all clinical trials looking at COPD have been limited to smokers, and typically people with a 10-pack year floor. And there may be a couple of other studies out there, with less than 10-pack years, but in my sort of look through and talking to other people with more expertise in that space, that's what we were dealing with. Currently the studies looking at never smokers have been limited to people with smoke exposure. So really not a focus on patients with occupational or other environmental exposures. And so this, I think, is the real opportunity to look at COPD in these other populations. And I always end my COPD talks with this, that COPD is a preventable and treatable disease.
Thank you very much, David. We are running a little late, so I think I'm going to cancel the Q&A for these first two talks. You'll have a chance to raise questions with Drs. Barr and Menino in the more general discussion later. Let's move ahead with Dr. Henneberger's talk now, please.
Okay, let me share my, let me share my page here. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding it. Okay, sorry, just a second.
If you have questions or comments related to these first two talks, you can go ahead and enter something in the Q&A, and we'll catch up to it later. Don't trust your memory. Go ahead and put it in now.
I'm afraid I'm going to start over on this. Just a second. Sorry. Okay, let me. I'm sorry, is it in presentation mode or?
Yeah, in display settings.
Yeah, you still have the preview.
Display settings now is a swap presenter view. Hold on a second. Do it now.
Yep.
Yeah, that's it.
Is that it? Okay, fine. Sorry for the hold up. So I will be talking about some of the epidemiologic evidence for occupational COPD, and rather than in fact, I won't be talking about smoking or non-smoking related COPD, but I'm not going to be repeating what I will not repeat what Dr. Paul Blanc did this morning. Well, morning where I am, at least, perhaps afternoon where you are. But we'll talk about some selected topics in the epidemiology of occupational COPD. And I have no conflicts of interest or financial disclosures to declare. And the objective of my presentation is to examine selected aspects of the epidemiologic evidence. And in particular, I want to talk about the variety of occupational exposures and occupational settings associated with COPD in a little bit more detail. Also, look at the risk for COPD among exposed workers based on exposures assessed using a job exposure matrix. And in both these topics, I will do some defining of certain terms and expressions that might be known by many of people in the audience, but not all. So I want to pick up on those. I will talk briefly about the quantitative estimate of occupational contribution to the burden of COPD, and then some conclusions, including some looking forward to additional research. So looking at occupational exposures and workplace settings associated with COPD, I'm going to talk about findings from a 2014 systematic review. So this was published in 2014. The lead author was Omland. And they reviewed articles from EPI studies with a focus on spirometry-based definitions of airflow obstruction. As we see, as we have seen from different presentations, there are different definitions of COPD. In this case, it had to do with airflow obstruction. The investigators started with over 4,500 references, and they deleted references that lacked spirometry measurements, occupational exposure classifications, a reference group, or lacked adjustment for age or smoking. And they ended up with 59 studies for data extraction, including 37 cross-sectional and 22 longitudinal. And there were 25 population-based and 34 industry-based, or industry or occupation-based studies. And the 34 industry or occupation-based studies addressed both, some addressed inorganic or mineral dust exposures, and that accounted for 15 of them, and 19 addressed organic or biological dust exposures. And these studies varied in design, participants, the way in which they use spirometry to define the outcome, and also in their exposure assessment. So I want to just take a pause here and talk about some options for exposure assessment in epidemiologic studies of COPD. Now, one of the most common approaches used is self-reports, and this can be done frequently in the context of a survey. And this could be job, occupation, or industry. And this could include either a partial work history. In other words, for the sake of time, you ask about current and or longest held job, or it could be lifetime work history. And the lifetime work history represents quite an investment in survey time, and also in terms of having someone present the work, the questions about lifetime work history to the participant. So it's a much greater lift in terms of research. Self-reports can also relate to exposures to either specific agents or to types of agents. And as we've seen in several of the presentations today, there's a special interest in vapors, gas, dusts, and fumes when it comes to COPD. Another approach is to use a job exposure matrix, or a GEM, in which you use the person's work history, whether it's complete work history or some partial one like longest held job, and put it into a matrix that renders an assignment of exposure. A few studies have used expert opinion, in which experts review someone's work history and render a decision about exposure. In industry or occupation-specific studies, there have been studies in which exposure measurements were taken from personal area samples and either used to assign, typically used to assign exposures to a specific individual, or sometimes combined with a job exposure matrix, used to inform a job exposure matrix to assign exposures based on where you've worked and how long you've worked. And finally, in some studies, typically, again, the industry or occupation-based ones, investigators are able to use employee records to discern where someone has worked, how long they've worked, and what kind of jobs they were doing. Well, in the review, a systematic review conducted by Omland and colleagues, for the population-based studies, 80% of those studies relied on self-reports to inform exposure assessment. And with the industry and occupation-based ones, it was much more likely to be informed by personal and or area sampling in which exposures were actually measured, and a little bit shy of a quarter of the industry occupational ones also used self-reports instead. Now from the 34 industry or occupation-based studies, these addressed a variety of exposures in workplaces. On the inorganic side, it was welding, coal, coke, asphalt, silica, cement work, tunnel work, cadmium, glass, and bleachery work in the pulp paper industry. And the organic side, it was cotton, flax, jute, farming, which was obviously not a particular exposure, but a general work setting, grain, wood, rubber, and endotoxin. And these 34 studies were, over half of them were conducted in Europe, another 8 in the United States, and 7 sort of in all other parts of the world. And for the 7 others, those included 1 in Taiwan for welding, 3 in China, 1 for coke, another 2 on the organic side, cotton and jute, 1 in India for glass, and 2 from South Africa on the organic side for grain and wood. The major finding was that COPD was associated with occupational exposures in 86% of the studies. So in other words, this was true for the population-based studies, 22 of 25, as well as for the industry or occupation-based studies, 29 of 34. And it was also the vast majority of both the inorganic exposures as well as the organic exposures. Another major finding was that dose-response relationships were very common, and that these findings were consistent across many of these studies, despite methodological differences between them. So the final conclusion, which I don't think is overstated, is the following. There is a strong and consistent evidence to support a causal association between multiple categories of occupational exposure and COPD, both within and across industry groups. Now, in terms of the risk for COPD among exposed workers, I want to talk a little bit more about the use of a job exposure matrix and focus on findings from a 2017 systematic review and meta-analysis that was conducted by Sadra and colleagues. And I want to talk a little bit about the basics of a job exposure matrix. Now, this is likely obvious to some of you and not so obvious to others. And so I'd like to cover this information. GEMS have 2 or more dimensions typically with occupations or industries on one axis and 1 or multiple exposures on the other axis. And there can be additional dimensions that can include calendar time or other factors. And the cells in the GEM can include information on intensity or probability of exposure. So a qualitative GEM at its simplest is simply yes or no for exposure given a particular job. Or it could be assign different levels of, for example, low, medium, high. Quantitative GEMs tend to have a more complex exposure score beyond low, medium, and high, or they actually assign a certain concentration, for example, a certain dust concentration of exposure. So at its simplest, a GEM for COPD could focus on the exposures of vapors, gas, dust, and fumes across the one axis. On the other axis then are the different occupations. And so for any one occupation, there's some combination of yeses and nos for these different exposures of interest. Some other thoughts about GEMs is that they're only as good as the knowledge used to construct a GEM. So you want to, you want to build in the intelligence so it functions well. It provides relatively objective exposure measurement assessments rather, and it's considered less susceptible to bias than self-reported exposures. The self-reported exposures are sometimes argued for on the basis that they're more specific to the individual, but they can also have the problem of having biased reports. In other words, people with respiratory problems can be more likely to report the exposure than those who do not have problems, which would artificially increase could artificially increase the odds ratio or whatever the estimate of relative risk you're using. The final point here is that many GEMs have already been developed and they can be used by researchers to study COPD. You don't necessarily need to go out and create your own GEM to be able to use one. There are multiple ones that have already been developed and can be requested from researchers. So in this review by Sadra and colleagues, they started with 66 references from their literature search and deleted references that did not use a GEM or failed to use relevant outcomes, adjusted effect estimates, or confidence intervals for effect estimates. So they selected 29 studies for data extraction. All GEMs assigned exposure to at least one of the following types of exposures: the vapors, gas, dust, and fumes, which I've already mentioned, and also fibers, although I won't show any results for fibers because it was a very small number of studies. And the most common GEM used in these studies was a general population GEM, which is typically based on expert opinion. Now, the specific types of GEMs used are included the following. The Aloha GEM is one that was developed in Europe a number of years ago and has gone through some changes over the years and is still commonly used. Another one that the Sadra and colleagues referred to as the Blanc GEM, developed by Paul Blanc and colleagues, is one that is also commonly used. NIOSH developed a GEM several years back, which is available. And then finally, the MRC, or Medical Research Council GEM. And less common were industry or occupation specific GEMs based on measured exposures. Now, 9 of the studies that they selected included both self-reported and GEM-based exposures for each participant, and they looked at summary ORs, odds ratios for self-reported exposure, and using different outcomes. And in this case, with the results here, it was either a physician diagnosis of COPD or spirometric results that met criteria consistent with airflow obstruction. And what we see here is that for self-reported exposures versus GEM-based, the self-reported have higher estimates of odds ratio than the GEM-based one. And with the additional outcome of chronic bronchitis, it's a similar trend with 1.60 of the odds ratio for self-reported exposures, 1.24 for GEM-based. Now, when all the data from all 29 studies were included, we see summary estimates for odds ratio that were statistically elevated and statistically significant for all the occupational exposures. So it was highest, somewhat higher rather, 1.37 for dust, and under that, in the subcategories of biological dust was very close to that, and mineral dust was lower. And also there was a somewhat higher odds ratio of 1.24 for vapors. For the outcome of chronic bronchitis, while the dust also, once again, had a high odds ratio, there was little difference between biological and mineral dust, and once again, vapors had a high odds ratio of 1.4. So what we see is very strong associations of COPD defined in different ways with a variety of exposures. Now, I want to talk briefly about the quantitative estimate of occupational contribution to the burden of COPD. And if you were present for the presentations in the first section today, you heard quite a bit about this from Dr. Paul Blanc, who led this committee to produce this official American Thoracic Society and European Respiratory Society statement that was published in 2019. And this really is an authoritative reference. They relied on 26 high-quality population-based studies of occupation and COPD, and arrived at pooled estimates of population attributable fraction, or the PAF. And the overall PAF, which includes studies in which there were smokers and they adjusted for smoking, was 14%, or approximately 1 in 7 cases. And this estimate was even higher, limited to the 6 high-quality studies that stratified on smoking status, so that for never smokers, the PAF was estimated at 31%. Well, in conclusion, based on the information I just presented, and also on a lot of other studies, I think it's clear that COPD is associated with occupational exposures in various industries and occupations. So the risk is in some ways widespread. Secondly, exposed workers experience a significant increase in risk for COPD associated with a variety of exposures. These findings are based on numerous studies conducted in multiple nations using different methodologies, so there's a durability to the findings. And occupation makes a substantial contribution to the burden of COPD, with PAF estimates of 14% overall, and about twice that at 31% for never smokers. Looking to the future, I think additional studies are needed to identify the tasks, tools, and agents associated with an increased risk for COPD. One area in which this could, I think, happen in particular is studies that would identify new risk factors for COPD in emerging industries. And the information from these studies will hopefully be used to inform primary prevention efforts. A second point is that intervention and intervention effectiveness studies are needed. There are very few such studies noted in the literature, and additional ones are needed. Finally, thinking back to what I presented, what I showed with the evidence summarized in the Ohnland review, studies are especially needed outside of Europe and the United States. The suspicion is that the damaging exposures that could lead to COPD are happening in a lot of countries, but there has not been a strong light of research shined on those work situations to reveal the problems. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, thank you, Paul. Our final presenter in this session is Dr. Theodore Litras, who will be talking about issues of compounding and latency and epidemiology.
Thank you. So let me share. I think you can now see my screen. So greetings everyone. My name is Theodore Litras. I'm an epidemiologist, and I have been involved in one of the studies indirectly covered by Dr. Herrenberger's presentation one of the studies that established the relationship between occupational exposures and COPD, namely the the ECRHS, the European Community Respiratory Health Survey. So I have nothing to disclose, and I will try to keep it brief. So despite the different definitions, epidemiological, clinical, etc., of COPD, we can all agree that the process leading up to COPD involves either or both accelerated lung function decline over the years, or also a low baseline lung function. And of the two, occupational COPD is basically associated with accelerated lung function decline as a result of chronic exposure to noxious exposure like VGDF, vapors, gases, dusts, and fumes. As a result, for a cohort study of work-related COPD, one needs long follow-up, because you need a long follow-up in order to have sufficient exposure to demonstrate an association between these occupational exposures and COPD. Similarly, for a case control or a cross-sectional study, you need relatively older study participants to maintain a reasonable sample size. This presents unique challenges, as we'll see. Alternatively, if you don't have much time, you can study, instead of studying the incidence or the rate of incidence of COPD, you can study lung function decline as your outcome. But it's still pretty difficult because individual trajectories of lung function are highly variable, and you need still at least 2 and or likely more than 2 follow-up visits to increase precision. So in order to reliably estimate the trajectories for each individual. So it's still difficult. Due to this long time frame required to demonstrate using epidemiology an association between occupational exposures and COPD, there are certain challenges. People may not possess the same occupational exposures over time. People often change jobs, and also within the same job exposures may decrease, thanks, hopefully, to occupational health and safety standards improving over time. Worse than that, if people are adversely affected, they may switch jobs or retire from their noxious jobs. This is what we call the healthy worker effect. In addition, people may be exposed to multiple occupational factors, occupational exposures, both during their lifetimes and also at the same job. So there are jobs with multiple simultaneous exposures, and one needs to try to disentangle these. At the same time, people may be exposed to other risk factors which could play an important confounding role, most importantly, smoking. And these confounders are also themselves not stable over time. But as we'll see, by far the biggest challenge in epidemiological studies of work-related COPD is exposure measurement. As Dr. Herrenberger covered already, for general population-based studies, the optimum way to measure occupational exposures are job exposure matrices, rather than self-report of occupational exposures by the participant himself or herself, which is likely to be biased and substantially biased. This is what we call recall bias, with people having currently poor health more likely to report being exposed. GEMS, job exposure matrices, group together particular occupations in terms of their exposures to particular agents, allowing us more reliable estimation with a given sample size. And you can have qualitative or semi-quantitative GEMS like the Aloha GEM, which provides a semi-quantitative quantitative estimate for 12 different exposures, namely no exposure, low exposure, or high exposure for each particular job, and for 12 different exposures. And you can also have quantitative GEMS that incorporate additional dimensions, like most notably the FinGem, a gem from Finland, which is quite detailed. Gems generally favor specificity over sensitivity. So people developing job exposure matrices try to be fairly specific and be very conservative in assigning a particular exposure to an occupation. As a result, though, the non-category will include some possibly exposed workers. So there is already a degree of misclassification there. Most importantly, though, job exposure matrices, despite their objectivity, they mask by design important heterogeneity, both across different jobs and also within different jobs. So within the same job, you can have people having very different exposures. Indeed, exposure classification based on job codes may objectively be insufficient to determine accurately the exposure of every person. In addition, what about the time dimension? Because if COPD is a cumulative pathophysiological process, we must treat exposures in the same fashion and consider the time dimension. So for that, one can use cumulative measures, like, for example, years or intensity years. So years of exposure weighted by intensity of exposure according to the GEM over a person's working life, instead of just classifying people into never exposed versus at least once being low exposed versus at least once being ever high exposed. This latter classification, simple classification, ever high, ever low, and never, is the classification we used for our paper with COPD incidence as its outcome. And we also examined lung function decline as an outcome at a separate paper using cumulative measures, using intensity years of exposure. However, using cumulative measures for such an imprecise method of exposure assessment as a GEM only converts all this heterogeneity of the GEM into regression dilution, which biases any true association, any potential true association with lung function or COPD towards the null. And what is regression dilution? Quite simply, if one has measurement errors on the outcome, or if you have outcome misclassification, this results in increased imprecision, increased random error than bias. So no bias with measurement errors on the outcome. However, with measurement errors on the exposure, you will actually have what we call in statistics slope attenuation, meaning you get in your regression model an effect estimate that is biased towards the null. This also applies to other regression models, logistic Poisson, not just the linear model. I'm just showing the plot from a linear regression in order to clarify how this works. So if you measure your exposures with error on the x-axis, the regression line that you observe, the dashed line, compared to the true association, which is unobserved, in this case the blue line. So the observed association will be attenuated. Interestingly, one can apply adjustments, statistical adjustments for this phenomenon, but only if you have an error model and data to inform this error model, which we invariably do not have regarding actual people's exposures. And this regression dilution bias is probably the reason we found such a weak association between cumulative occupational exposure and lung function. So in our paper, in our ECRHS paper, we did find statistically significant accelerated declines in FEV1 and the FEV1 to FVC ratio, namely for exposures to biological dust, mineral dusts, and metals, out of the 12 exposures of the aloha gem. But the size of this difference was fairly small, given that we're talking about 25 intensity years of exposure. And reading this, one might think that, okay, this is not clinically significant. Unfortunately, it is. Probably the small magnitude of this is the result of regression dilution bias. Interestingly, again, these declines in our analysis, in our statistical analysis, were comparable in magnitude with those associated with long-term smoking. So we adjusted for pack years of smoking in this regression model, but and the effects we saw between exposures, occupational exposures and smoking were similar, comparable, but probably this only shows that there's a lot of measurement error in estimation of pack years of exposure as well. So possibly also an attenuated relationship there. Still, this shows again that occupational exposures are very significant in accelerating lung function decline. So besides GEMS, what else can we do to measure exposure? Unfortunately, in a general population cohort setting, probably very, very little. One thing that it is theoretically possible and might be a thing in the future is exposure biomarkers. However, their specificity is an issue. So having a biomarker that is specific for certain occupational exposures. And already we got very few such biomarkers compared to the multitude of exposures and chemical out there. And hopefully in the future, we might get more detailed environmental or personal exposure measurements, hopefully not only in an occupational cohort, but maybe in a general population cohort in the far future. But still a long way to go until we have such sensors that are small enough and cheap enough for wide use. Now, moving on to confounding. For a covariate to be an impactful confounder, we need to appreciate that it needs to be strongly associated with both exposure, namely occupational exposures in our case, and outcome, namely COPD or lung function decline. And also, by the way, the confounder should not be influenced by either the exposure or outcome, because if such a covariate is a result of the exposure or the outcome and not a proximate cause of the exposure or outcome, then it's not a confounder, it's a collider. And adjusting for it will introduce bias in your study. In practice, however, confounding is not that much of a concern, at least in magnitude compared to exposure misclassification. Two confounders two candidate confounders, let's say, that are often considered in studies of occupational exposures are socioeconomic status and asthma. Could socioeconomic status be associated with COPD directly through other pathways, so not via occupational exposures? The association between socioeconomic status and occupational exposures is crystal clear. We have a lot of evidence of that, but we can debate and discuss the extent to which socioeconomic status that influences your COPD risk through other pathways as well. That's much less clear. Asthma also affects lung function on its own and could also be associated with the choice of occupation, which is what we epidemiologists call a healthy worker hire effect, meaning people with asthma might select particular jobs that are less harmful to their asthma. So in practice, in our ECRHS study with COPD as outcome, which was a fairly long study with a sample size of 3,300 participants, followed up over 20 years, In that study, we adjusted for socioeconomic status and also restricted the cohort to participants without current asthma at baseline. And remember that restriction is also a form of adjustment. So we essentially adjusted for current asthma at baseline by restricting the cohort. We also adjusted for smoking pack years and importantly, for the percent predicted FEV1 to FVC ratio at baseline, which and both these, both smoking and initial lung function, are strongly associated with the incidence of COPD in the model. And we found in this analysis an association between biological dust, gases and fumes, and pesticides with COPD. Besides the main analysis, though, we attempted several variations on the analysis, and you can find those in multiple tables in the online supplement of our article. And we saw that in these extra analysis, we varied the covariates that we adjusted for. So omitting adjustment for socioeconomic status did not materially change the attempted associations. And this is probably because in the full model, socioeconomic status was not associated with the incidence of COPD. So it makes sense that omitting adjustment for it did not make a difference in our study. Also, excluding participants reporting asthma at follow-up, even though this was 11% of the sample who reported having asthma symptoms 20 years after, excluding this also did not materially change the estimated associations between occupational exposures and COPD incidence. What did attenuate these associations, though, was defining COPD using pre-bronchodilator spirometry. So in the ECRHS, in the first two follow-ups and at baseline, we only had pre-bronchodilator spirometry, but at the third follow-up, at the second follow-up, 20 years from baseline, we did both pre and post bronchodilator spirometry. And this actually did make a difference. So associations with pre-bronchodilator spirometry at follow-up were significantly attenuated. And this is a typical example of what epidemiologists call non-differential outcome misclassification. So essentially what I'm suggesting here is that a number of people who would appear to have COPD using pre-bronchodilator spirometry actually did not have COPD if you use post-bronchodilator. So it appears confounding is not that much a concern, at least when you have the big elephant in the room, which is exposure classification. And it appears strong associations with exposure and outcome are both required in order to have a substantial confounding effect. Also, as I mentioned in the first slides, occupational exposures are often highly correlated, and indeed in our study, there were strong associations, particularly between certain groups of exposures, such as the different variations of pesticides or between biological dusts and gases and fumes, etc. Our analysis was quote unquote univariate, meaning but still adjusted for many things. So comparing the people associated to each of these 12 agents to people not exposed to this particular agent, but possibly exposed to other agents. We also did a comparison with the wholly unexposed group, so exposed to unexposed to all these exposures, and thankfully this also did not substantially alter the associations. Therefore, in conclusion, to sum up, in order to address confounding, take a deep breath. It's probably not that big a deal in occupational epidemiology, but think carefully and by all means draw a DAG, a directed acyclic graph. So plotting the postulated associations between all the covariates. This DAG automatically shows you which covariates you should adjust for. Occupational exposure assessment is still the biggest challenge by far in occupational epidemiology. So measuring each person's occupational exposures. And for this reason, because of this limitation, detecting an association between occupation and COPD is, so to speak, relatively easy, but reliably estimating its magnitude is fairly hard. We need definitely large and long studies with improved exposure assessment. And I would dare to suggest that due to these limitations around exposure assessment, it might be the case, we will find hopefully in the next years or decades, it might be the case that the occupational burden of COPD might end up being larger than 14%, precisely because we measure occupational exposure with error. If we could accurately measure it, we might find that their actual effect might be even larger. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Litros. I think what we'll probably do here is move into the panel discussion. Invite the 4 presenters to come online. And I'll invite all of the viewers of this webinar to enter questions or comments that you may have for any of the 4 speakers in the Q&A, which I'll monitor and confer to the panel.
Well, it just one addition to that, Tom. This is Paul Hanneberger, who's also on the organizing committee for the webinar. The panel discussion was also intended to include speakers from the first section of today. So that would include, as I see now, David Fishwick, Raphael De La Hoz, and also Susan Harlow. So I realize the sessions, the Q&A and the panel discussion are being sort of smooshed together. So I think we also include the other 3 as well from this morning's session. So
thank you for that. Drs. Fisher, Tarlow, and De La Hoz, please do join us here.
Well, I would like to hear Paul Hanneberger's comment in relation to Theodore's comments about, do we need more detail or less? Because there was a moment where I thought, that apparently more detail introduced more error, and it remains to be a limiting factor. So that we need more, less, and in some of the work from Paul Blanks, VGDF actually introduced less detail, and for some reason ended up giving estimates that were qualitatively better, just to be so. Where are we with exposure assessment? And because we are advocating for their inclusion in ongoing studies, and so where are we with those? What is what we really need there in terms of improving our chances of quantitating this?
well, I'm not sure my answer is going to be as sophisticated as Dr. Litros, but the efforts in job exposure matrix is if anything more and more towards informing them with measured exposures as much as possible. I mean, there's gaps at times where you have to rely on expert opinion, but so I think there's still the emphasis of improving quality of of assessment with a gem by improving the information and the knowledge you pack into the gem. I think there are these issues about that you can inadvertently introduce error, but I still think that if anything, my understanding of the exposure assessment community is moving towards using more information based on measured exposures. And you see this sometimes in certain industrial settings, like there was a study published by Nordby and colleagues of cement industry where they had, I think it was a dozen plants in 8 different countries, and they had like over 6,000 measurements of dust in all these different plants over a number of years. So I think that's where it's going, but I'd be curious to hear what Dr. Lutris has to say as well.
Yeah, that's correct. I fully agree. This is indeed the case, but unfortunately, we're still a long way from an actual personalized, let's say, assessment of occupational exposure. But indeed, this is the direction that things are moving to.
May I ask about latency that was in the title of your presentation, Dr. Lutris? So do you think that there is a minimum latency period for the development of work-related COPD? And what do you think has been found from studies so far?
I'm really not sure. Depending on your initial lung function, your baseline lung function, indeed you need some time until you develop COPD. So in terms of the epidemiology, depends. You need indeed some long follow-up. So if you have an epidemiological study that is fairly short, you cannot use probably COPD as an outcome, or you need a large sample size. So I'm not really sure about the question here.
Well, I just wonder if there are population studies and you're including all workers in those studies.
Sorry, you've been muted.
Susan, you got muted a couple of sentences back.
Oh, sorry. I just wonder if you're including a total population and not considering the latency, you may be diluting the effect because you wouldn't expect to see changes in those who have only had the exposure for a few years.
Yes, this is true, but I think probably mostly has to do with the age of the participants. So our cohort, the ECRHS, has been a fairly young cohort, and indeed we didn't see such a strong effect only with the first follow-up. The effect was only visible with the second follow-up of the cohort after 20 years, but this probably has to do with the fact that the cohort has aged. So they are at substantially increased risk of COPD. So it's a matter of baseline risk, really.
Tom, it's David Fisher. I think it's a really CCIS cohort and also Cotton to suggest that if you're going to develop a COPD-like effect, you develop it quite quickly, and actually as you age, your annual decline lessens with time. Presumably you get to a point where you can't lose much more lung function without dying from that disease. But there are some suggestions that this is front-ended, that you might see it relatively early on rather than as a homogeneous effect with time. But again, Theodore, I'm not sure if you picked up on any of those in the work you've been doing.
No, I have not, and indeed that's very interesting.
I had a question for Raphael related to his presentation this morning. That I was particularly interested in the World Trade Center subpopulation that increased their lung function, which we know physiologically shouldn't happen. And the question is, was this some sort of selection bias or regression to the mean? And what did these people look like clinically? Because that shouldn't happen. So I'm very curious. And I could see it as a percentage of predicted, maybe, but as an absolute increase. And that just struck me as being puzzling.
I don't know where to start with that one. But you know that I started long ago because you once visited New York, and I actually tried to show you, because we were finding this in one of the limitations that we have in the World Trade Center in our particular cohort is that we don't have pre-World Trade Center measurements of lung function. So we can sometimes work with hypothetical predicteds, and there were differences between the three groups. So problem number one, those who were the accelerated decliners actually had more lung function predicted to lose. If we use that theoretical, they had higher predicted. It wasn't a huge difference, but there was. If we use the predicted and assume these people were normal and were close to their predicted, they would have had the bigger lung function. On the other hand, they separated nicely, so we think that it's not a spurious finding. Right now, we are looking at some quantitative CT markers to try to see if we see a different type of lung injury in those who are gainers compared to the decliners, and try to answer that. Because we had some indication, for example, what if we found that instead of fibrosing changes, we had more ground glass that were more inflammatory types that could recede, in the gainers, for example.
And that would make sense, and that would be
exactly important. So it's just one possibility. It's not even the only one, not close to being the only one, but at least one that we plan to pay attention to. And one thing that I can answer that we already published was, and that I mentioned to Susan, I said earlier that the accelerated decliners were gaining weight. The gainers were losing weight. So yeah,
so they restrictive. And I had a quick question for Graham also, that and I've seen you present over the years this wonderful data on quantitative imaging stuff. When I get a CT scan report from our radiologist, it says emphysema, a little bit of emphysema, or moderate degree of emphysema, with no sort of numerical estimate where you can compare it from one time to the next. How far away are we from seeing that type of stuff clinically, or is it so protected by protected algorithms and proprietary stuff that we'll never see it? Because that's very frustrating to me.
Yeah, no, it's just thanks for the question. It's some of this can move very, very quickly, and it's just that the medical system that we have, most CT scans are designed for taking pictures rather than producing numbers, and the radiologists are mostly paid to read, use their eyes to read, whereas nobody's really paying for a quick quantitative assessment. In reality, it's extremely fast. It's extremely easy. The major issues are standardization of the protocol, which is pretty easy to do at a center. So, for example, University of Michigan Health System has, I think at this point, fully standardized their sort of standard clinical CT acquisition, and just spits out percent emphysema and a bunch of other numbers as part of their radiology workflow. It's more, none of this, well, some bits, I mean, obviously there are companies involved and some of this is patented, but nothing that I showed is patented. There was plenty of open source approaches to do this. It's just sort of an inertia to get it through. But we're hoping as you know, this is something that could move very quickly if the field demanded it. And presumably the final point was, you know, lung cancer screening at this point is pretty much the only screening test that is proven in randomized trials to actually save lives in addition to cancer-related lives. And this is going to increasingly come such that, that's going to force some quantification. So hopefully this will move reasonably quickly. Certainly the technology is absolutely there to do it. It's just more inertia in the system.
I have a question for Grant because and it's kind of funny that I'm asking a question to somebody who is in my same city with the phone. But you mentioned you focus quite a bit on emphysema, and many studies of COPD actually have de-emphasize the role of emphysema in the functional change in COPD and focus on small airways. And also the third component of COPD is supposed to be, you know, more proximal chronic bronchitis. And quantitative CT has actually all three, right? As you know very, very better than anyone around here. So the question is, where do we go? Because you know, you said quantitative CT produces more data than we can possibly make any use of. But the other thing is, for example, in the World Trade Center population, we do see certainly proximal airway inflammation and low attenuation volume %, which is, you know, a surrogate for emphysema, as correlated with those accelerated declines that I mentioned before. Those we have already shown, and what we had problems with the small airway measurements. They have been elusive. Well, and I'm not going to get into details into those. But where do we see us? You know, because you are focusing on emphysema, but you also have a lot of data on wall area %, and I don't know what you're. So where do we go from here? How do we integrate these things? And are we talking even about classes of COPD? We probably are. And how do we integrate that into research in occupational exposures and COPD?
Yeah, the quick answer is that the parenchyma, I mean, I focused on the parenchyma because back in the day it was easier. And there's probably more there in terms of subtyping. The airways are very challenging. The currently available sort of standard measures are, in my opinion, not everybody shares this, have their limitations and have been biased in various different ways. You know, on the other hand, people like Ben Smith have produced some work on disynapsis, which was sort of alluded to earlier, in early life influences that are really fundamental and very important. Small airways, in some ways, is more, in my mind, are a little bit more redundant with what we get from spirometry. And there's a lot of measurement. They're tricky to measure well. So that's the other reason to sort of, for me, focus more on the parenchyma. But it's not the airways aren't important. They're clearly important, but there are some technical challenges too. A question for the group, and this is partly for Theodore, but also others. In terms of the issue of, yeah, I mean, you absolutely correctly point out the problems with measurement, exposure measurement and measurement error there. Do we see a way forward in sort of the multi-omic world? And I guess I'm partly been impressed with, I mentioned Anna Navas's work in terms of mentals. She's done a lot in cardiovascular disease already. We're just starting in pulmonary, but more general metabolomic areas as a surrogate for environmental exposure or occupational exposures at this level.
Sure, that's the hope. Hopefully, if we try hard enough and if we do a lots of research, we may find some biomarkers that will be exposure biomarkers for such occupational exposures. But still, this is an area of intense research, but still we have some way to go. But that's probably where the next step up in exposure measurement will come from.
And in fact, earlier today, Dr. Fishwick showed us cadmium data. And cadmium, in fact, is a long-term biomarker. It happens to be stored in the kidneys and the liver, and reflects long-term exposure. In the secondhand smoke world, we have cotinine, which was it gives you 4 days worth of exposure in the urine, maybe a month's worth if you look at hair. But there are sort of little examples out there, for a longer term exposure is what we need. And of course, in the world of dust, vapors, gases, and fumes, and that would be a more challenging, because in the absence of a specific agent, but in the future, and this is sort of somewhat unfortunate, but now we have an entire population of people that are using vaped products. And so I think we're going to see perhaps long-term exposures related to that may unfortunately also lead to the development of respiratory disease. So I think and it may be in the world of omics or specific biomarkers, but I do see us sort of getting there. And at least in the secondhand smoke world, it's been well established that measured exposures work far better than reported exposures when you look at outcomes.
I wish I could be equally optimistic. Indeed, there is some progress, and probably we'll see some progress, but specificity is indeed the big issue. And also, you mentioned vaping products. Probably there is a lot of heterogeneity in the composition of the different products there. So hopefully we might find some biomarker that will show us exposure to all of these products, but it will be difficult. Still, if we research many compounds, hopefully we will find something.
On another topic, this morning, Dr. Blanc mentioned interest in more research related to exacerbation of COPD. In other words, in the association of COPD exacerbation from, associated with occupational exposures. And I'm just sort of curious what others think about that. I was wondering, David, if you had any thoughts about that, David Menino, or David Fishwick, actually both of you. You could first one, then the other. How the opinion?
Sure, I'll do this quickly. And there's if you look at exacerbations, well, actually in this Lancet Commission report, there's a lot of thought rethinking how we've defined exacerbation. There's a lot of it sort of based on Nick Antonison's work from years ago, and that's sort of being rethought because things have changed dramatically since then. But if you look at exacerbations, about 70% are related to infections, half and half viral and bacterial, and then the other sort of proportion is related to environmental exposures. Air pollution has been looked at the most, but if you look at what happens in the world of occupational exposures, it's basically air pollutants that are typically at a much higher concentration. So of course I say, yeah, that's why not? And of course in World Trade Center we have an entire population that were exposed to very high levels of particulate air pollution. I don't know if David Fishwick has other sort of thoughts, but yeah, absolutely. Why not? I think it's well established that that's an important exposure.
Nothing really more to add. Thank you, David. I'm really glad you went first. But I think it's fair to say that there are groups looking at occupational exposures and exacerbation of asthma, which we would probably think is mostly infection, but there are at least two or three studies out there looking at trying to quantify very accurately what occupational exposures were in the 2 or 3 weeks running up to an asthma exacerbation. And I'm sure that the same techniques could be applied to COPD, and it's my gut feeling a lot of this relates to particle load, and then the mucociliary escalator is just not working, and then, as you say, infection becomes more important.
Let me address a question to the panel at large. Much of the emphasis of the talks and the discussion so far has been on exposures and their effects, perhaps relative to smoking as causative for COPD. Are there data that are more informative of susceptibility for perhaps a given type or level of exposure? Do the studies that have been done inform individual characteristics that might identify those who are more or less susceptible to the development of COPD? And if not, is that an area of research that is feasible and worthwhile?
Well, I can certainly jump in. Yeah, there's a growing sort of body of evidence that, looking at early life exposures, respiratory infections prior to the age of 2, genetic factors. And there was just an article that came out looking at sort of some of these polygenic models of COPD, looking at a number of different genetic factors that sort of factor in. And in the Lancet Commission report, they make the case that that COPD is sort of has its origins in childhood and actually even prenatally, but then sort of starts manifesting in adults. And somebody this morning showed the Lange paper that shows that some people never sort of reach their full maximal lung growth. That would probably be an increasing factor in susceptibility. So yeah, it's I think all of these things are important, both prenatal and early life exposures, and then sort of like the the occupational and other sort of exposures that we see in adult life that are sort of combined to cause chronic lower respiratory disease that manifests in mid to late life.
I think as we learn more and we subphenotype our diseases, or putting it another way, or even just agree on what we're really talking about in terms of disease, this will greatly move things forward. I mean, if one looks at, for example, at straight gene environment interactions, I mean, the UK Biobank published a study 3 years ago, I think, that was looking at genetic risk score for COPD and then just smoking. So the interaction of smoking with the genetic risk score, and it was almost non-significant. It was like 0.05 as an interaction for sort of explaining more of the variability if we get COPD. So sort of at a gross level, it's kind of at least a gene environment construct is hard to prove even in pretty large sample size like that. But I think as we understand more about subphenotypes, and a couple that I mentioned today, this reputatively we found a couple of genes for that. The latter one actually lines up with the copper pathways that suddenly become a lot more interesting for specific occupational exposures and specific endpoints. One of the smoking related ones, similarly, there's a gene that does specific things in nicotinic pathways that should affect disease. And if we get at that level of specificity more generally, I think we'll be able to sort of understand a bit more of specific genetic risk and specific exposures that interact to end up lowering your lung function, et cetera.
It could be other than genetic, though. For example, I wonder about age, whether people in certain occupations are at greater risk if they're very young versus very old. And biologically, I see where you could argue it either way. Any other comments or final statements from our panelists? We are a little over, so I don't want to go on too much longer, but we could take a few more minutes for any final questions or statements that people might have.
I'd just like to say thanks. I'm looking forward to part 2 tomorrow. So.
All right, thank you to all the speakers and for the everyone who has attended. I think this has been a very in-depth and interesting set of presentations and discussions. And we will continue this at 11 Eastern time tomorrow.